respected as he deserves. Some of that is because much of his finest work has been lost. Some of his paintings have been attributed to other artists, like this self-portrait, which prior to the research for that exhibition happening right now, this was hanging in the Uffizi as a portrait of Perugino by his pupil Raphael. And Perugino had perhaps the misfortune of being the teacher of one of the greatest geniuses in the history of art, and being remembered primarily for that role. But imagine if Raphael had never assimilated the style of Perugino, without its sweetness, its gentle elegance, its effortless classicism, its fusion of the divine with the radiant landscape of Umbria. The art of Raphael, and much later art, might well have looked rather different than it does. These virtues, however, were not well recognized by the father of art history, Giorgio Vasari, when he penned the life of Perugino in his Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, first published in 1550, revised and expanded in 1568. Vasari seems to have detested Perugino for not having adapted his style to the new age of the High Renaissance. Vasari wrote that Perugino, quote, would have struck any evil bargain for money, end quote. And that, quote, he was a person of very little religion, and no one could ever make him believe in the immortality of the soul, end quote. Now, we only have Vasari's word on Perugino's irreligion. Countering that, we have his entire oeuvre of mostly religious art that seems to be quite sincere in its religious outlook. So we have to take Vasari with a grain of salt, because Vasari never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So, for instance, he writes about money as a motivator for Perugino's entire career, and Perugino being born in absolute poverty and misery, and having to escape that by becoming an artist. Well, we know that, we don't know Perugino's exact birth date, but we know his family in the town of Castel della Pieve, now Città della Pieve, that his family owned property, that they were not miserably poor. They were of the middle class. They were comfortable. Vasari then says that he studied with some Perugian master of very little merit. We don't know exactly who this was, but it may have been Benedetto Bonfigli or Bartolomeo Caporali, the two major painters in Perugia at that time, who sometimes collaborated, as they do here. And you can see that their work is somewhat old-fashioned, with the gold sky, creating the sense of a sacred space behind the holy figures. However, in a different life, that of a painter that Vasari admired greatly, Piero della Francesca, Vasari said that one of Piero's pupils was Pietro Perugino. Now, we don't have any evidence for that either. And we don't think that Pietro spent time in the atelier of Piero. But he certainly would have known Piero della Francesca's work, like this St. Anthony polyptych that hung in the cathedral in Perugia from the time that Perugino was about 18, and he would have been attracted to Piero della Francesca's interest in mathematical single-point perspective, which we see in the upper register of the polyptych, and in his use of light and the three-dimensionality of Piero's figures. Well, we do know that Pietro's next move was to Florence, away from the provinces and to the artistic capital where things were really happening, and that he was part of the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, which was an extraordinary place in the 1470s. Other assistants and apprentices at this time would have included Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio. So this was a real fulcrum for future Renaissance artists. Verrocchio was a sculptor primarily, and the Madonna you see on the left comes from a sculptural model, a relief, and you can see the young Perugino playing with this model, playing with the size of the baby, using very similar technique for the body of the baby, the pose, but adjusting it subtly for his own artistic personality to shine through. And a lot of Pietro's later work comes from Verrocchio. We know that he certainly would have acquired excellent skills in draftsmanship in Verrocchio's workshop. That was simply part of what an apprentice or an assistant did. Renaissance painting at this time is based on drawing. You would make gorgeous drawings, Verrocchio on the left, Perugino on the right, that you would then grid for transfer, and Perugino would save his drawings and use them more than once. Well, by 1472, Perugino was enrolled in the company of St. Luke, the Painters Guild in Florence. So he was by that time an independent artist. But instead of setting up in the extremely competitive environment of Florence, he returned to Perugia. And he got commissions there, like this important early commission of the little panels of Saint Bernardino. There were 8 of these. They hung vertically to either side of a sculpture of the saint, and 2 of them are securely attributed to Pietro. The healing of the young girl on the left, the healing of a blind and deaf man on the right. So we see here that interest in architecture, in using perspective, that Florentine invention, to create a sense of three-dimensionality within the world of the painting. There's an almost miniature-like, jewel-like quality to these works, and a love of detail. This is a bit of the architecture from the right-hand one, with its fake bronze medallion and fake sculpture and fake gems along the right-hand band. Then Perugino received this commission from the Baglioni family, an important Perugian family, for the adoration of the Magi. And the 3 Magi are portraits of different members of the Baglioni family. But it was conventional at the time for artists to insert a self-portrait in a crowd scene like this one. And so we believe that the figure there on the left, can you all see the little laser pointer thingy? Okay, so we believe this is our earliest self-portrait of Perugino, at the edge of the frame, but looking right out at the artist. So he was achieving so much renown in Perugia that in 1478, Perugino was invited to take on one of the most prestigious commissions imaginable. He was invited to fresco a chapel in the greatest church in Christendom, St. Peter's. Or as we now call it, Old St. Peter's, because it was completely demolished in the early 16th century to make way for the St. Peter's we all know now. So I cannot show you those works. However, they pleased the Pope so much that he invited Perugino to come paint the walls of his brand new papal chapel. The Pope was Sixtus IV. The chapel, the Sistine Chapel. It looked something like that before everything else had been built up around it. And of course, when we think of the Sistine Chapel, one name only pops into our heads. This is what it looked like before Michelangelo. So when it was built in the 1470s, Perugino was invited to create a fresco cycle around the walls, and it was clearly too much work, so a whole team of Central Italian artists would join Perugino in decorating the Sistine walls. And so Botticelli, Signorelli, and so forth, but Perugino had the choicest assignment: the altar wall. 3 scenes on the altar wall, and this is a computer reconstruction of what they looked like based on drawings and other things. Why can I not show you these? Because that altar wall is now Michelangelo's Last Judgment. And so Pietro's work was destroyed for Michelangelo's to go forward. The works were these 3. Here, the Finding of Moses. Here, the Nativity, the birth of Jesus. And here, the Assumption of the Virgin. And one of Perugino's assistants left us a record of the composition of that Assumption, which had 2 registers. A celestial register with the Virgin Mary and all of the heavenly host surrounding her, and a terrestrial register there at the bottom, but all united by the beautiful Umbrian landscape. You can just see bits and details, a couple of trees there, a hillside. This is very different from earlier representations of the same theme. So here's Fra Angelico nearly 50 years earlier, but you can see there's a wall behind the apostles, that lower register, and there is the gold ground in the upper register. There isn't the unity that Perugino would create that would be incredibly influential. So Raphael would use this kind of 2-tiered composition, but all within a believable Italianate space from the beginning of his career. He's about 19 when he painted this, until his very last painting. But not just Raphael. Titian would use it. Rubens would use it. It would be an incredibly influential conception of space, of religious, Christian figures. The one remaining fresco that Perugino painted by himself for the Sistine walls is the masterpiece from that cycle. It is, of all the surviving works, it is the clearest, the one that sums up this moment of time in art. It's Jesus giving the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter. And for the papacy, for the Catholic Church, that is equivalent to Jesus creating Peter as the first pope. And so that has a lot of significance for the Sistine Chapel, which was a papal chapel. The two buildings on either side, those triumphal arches, are based on Roman ruins that Raphael could see there in Rome. And the central building is the synagogue, the temple, that becomes the centralized planned church of Renaissance, Italian Renaissance Christianity. So this work, even today, when you look at it, and it's just in that little lower right-hand corner there, but you can kind of see that it's less crowded, less busy, more clear and ample and open than anything else. But you can also see how Michelangelo just dominates this space. Well, after the Sistine project, Perugino established a workshop in Florence and had Medici commissions like this Apollo and the shepherd Daphnis, we think, that he painted for Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was very fond of the classical world, Greek and Roman literature, mythology. The shepherd Daphnis is the Greek name for Laurus, or essentially Lawrence, so a link to Lorenzo. And if you can see in the sky, there is a hawk bringing down a pheasant, and that was a Medici emblem first used by Lorenzo's father. So this is one of Perugino's few mythological paintings. Much more characteristic is this crucifixion that he painted for the Dominican monastery in San Gimignano. And this, I was delighted to hear this work described by the curators of the show going on right now as one of the absolute gems of the exhibition, because I know it well from when I lived in the other Washington. It's a radiant painting. It is perhaps Perugino's most beautiful landscape, with those rocky outcroppings above the saints on either side, St. Jerome and St. Mary Magdalene. But it also has the germs of what would get Perugino in trouble later in his career. So I'm going to see if I can zoom in. I want you to look at the poses of St. John the Evangelist and St. Mary Magdalene. They are essentially the same pose. The feet are the same. The hands are very similar. The tilt of the head almost identical. And that was standard workshop practice at the time. You would make things go a little faster by reusing a sketch, a cartoon, just changing details of drapery and so forth. And we can see him reusing the entire conception of this work a decade later on the walls of Santa Maria Maddalena dei Pazzi in Florence. This is an enormous fresco, but it is based on that earlier crucifixion. with the three compartments and the beautiful scenery. In 1491, Giuliano della Rovere, the nephew of Sixtus IV, Pope Sixtus IV, and the future Julius II, commissioned this polyptych from Perugino, where we see again the crucifixion at the top. Based on that earlier example, we see it between, in this complicated multi-panel work, between the two panels of the Annunciation, the angel who in Christian thought is bringing to Mary the news that she is going to bear, the Son of God, and then the birth of that child down below, in a scene that might suggest what we are missing from not having the nativity of the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. Perugino was also a very fine portraitist, except we have few examples, and they are mostly other craftsmen like himself. Lorenzo di Credi was another of Verrocchio's pupils at the same time Perugino was. But Perugino seems to have had access to Northern Renaissance painting, to examples of portraiture like this one, Hans Memling's portrait of a man with a Roman coin, who may be Bernardo Bembo, may be an Italian subject, that you can see, and he may have had Memling transmitted to him via Leonardo, because Leonardo was also looking at Northern portraiture, looking at the way that the horizon gets blue and fuzzy, atmospheric perspective. But if we look at Memling's Man with a Roman Coin, and then look at Perugino's portrait of Francesco delle Opere, another very exquisitely skilled craftsman, a carver of seal stones, we can see that influence, we can see that atmospheric perspective, the fluffiness of the hair, and so forth. Now, this was painted in 1494. And Francesco delle Opere bears a little scroll thingy that says, Timete Deum, fear God. 1494 was the year that Lorenzo the Magnificent's son was supplanted as ruler of Florence by Savonarola. And Savonarola, with his bonfires of the vanities, burned mythological paintings, burned nudes, burned Venuses. So it's possible that Perugino painted more of them, and that they went up in flames during this difficult period in Florentine history. Timete Deum was a Savonarolan phrase. It's sort of, putting Francesco delle Opere in good with the Piagnoli, the Savonarolan followers. 1493, Perugino married a much younger woman. Now, he was 43-ish and she was maybe 17. But it's said that from that point forward, every Madonna he paints is a portrait of his lovely young wife. And she bore him 5 children, and his babies get really good. So he may really have been looking at babies in a way that some Renaissance artists, Michelangelo, were not. And so this is a very successful composition that Perugino used of the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus on a dais up high on a sort of a throne between the saints. So this was called a sacred or a holy conversation, was the word at the time for this kind of composition. They happen in Florence, they happen in Venice, but we see the relationship of the baby Jesus with one of the saints, of Mary with the other saint, who happens to be Saint Sebastian. So no more Apollos, but in Savonarola's Florence, the practically naked Saint Sebastian is just fine, because he is a religious figure. But I want you to appreciate the classicism of this beautiful painting of Saint Sebastian, the classicism of the columns, the Renaissance architecture behind him, again, the rolling hills of Umbria behind that, but the figure that is based on ancient Roman sculpture, and yet not muscle-bound, not stiff, but really clothed in believable, penetrable flesh with those arrows. It did not kill Saint Sebastian. He recovers from the arrows. Anyway, that format of the Virgin enthroned is something that Perugino would use multiple times for altarpieces like this one. This was a public commission commissioned by the Council of Ten for the Palazzo del Popolo, the town hall of Perugia. And I think it says that right on the frame, but he signs it right under Mary's feet, and he will repeat this sort of format with variations in altarpieces like this one. We do not know what church this was originally intended for, but you can see the format is quite similar. The saints are different, and they have determined that this was made by Perugino and at least 2 other hands, and scholars see the hand of Raphael in the St. Anthony there at the left, that bearded saint. That it looks a little different from most of Perugino's works. Here the Pietà, from these same years, from the years when Savonarola is ruling Florence. And so this is an appropriate scene. These darker, more mystical works for the period that Perugino is living through. And so we see what will become the theme of Michelangelo's great sculpture not long after this, the Pietà, the dead Jesus on his mother's lap, supported here by his followers, and with that beautiful Renaissance loggia organizing the space. And another lamentation from this period sets it out of doors, as Giotto had, and as Raphael would. Here it's a more crowded scene, and it's a tiny bit more emotional. Mary Magdalene has her hands raised, but Perugino never shouts. His work, it's quiet, it's composed, it's gentle. Its emotions are contained. And in 1894, winter of 1894-95, Perugino made a trip to Venice. And a work like this is almost unimaginable without that trip to Venice, or without influence from Giovanni Bellini and Venetian painting. That use of the dark background and these spotlit figures to give a little more emotional punch, to create this image that is, again, utterly, even though it is a nude, it is not an Apollo or a Venus, it is a nude Jesus. And so that wounded flesh is appropriate to this, this moment in Florence, when Florence is a theocracy. After Jesus' death comes resurrection. And this work is known as the Pope's Perugino. It's not on the walls of the Vatican museums. It's in the Pope's library, where he meets with heads of state. And it again has that double register, a little simpler this time, heaven and earth, a little more complicated in Jesus' ascension. This was originally part of a polyptych that was for the high altar of the Church of San Pietro in Perugia. And these two smaller panels of Saint Flavia and Saint Benedict were part of the predella. So they would have been originally underneath as part of the rest of the complex of this altarpiece, and there was a lunette above of God the Father welcoming Jesus into heaven. So it was part of a polyptych. But you can see here, this is that same composition that he invented for the Sistine Chapel with the heavenly figures, the angels, those marvelous swirling scrolls of Perugino's, but the composed figures watching this all happen, St. Peter and St. Paul's poses mirroring that of Jesus himself. And I just like to look at these because we can get closer, in a sense, and they're just so exquisite. But St. Flavia mirrors the pose of the Virgin Mary from the center of this altarpiece. You can see that they would have rhymed with one another. And then St. Benedict, another part of this panel. Now, we can also see Perugino's working process if we look at certain drawings, like this man in armor from about early 1490s. So this is not the sort of thing that Perugino would have had hanging around his studio. A suit of armor was bespoke. It was extremely expensive. He would have borrowed this and paid a model to sketch it and then given it right back to the wealthy person that it belonged to. But he based the pose on Donatello's St. George, a public work of art in Florence at the Or San Michele. But you can see it's not exact. It's inspired by Donatello, but Perugino's figure is a little more active, a little more strongly turned. His feet are planted. Do not step on that cord. His feet are planted a little more firmly. Shoot, what did I do? I really didn't. We're going to wait and let it, let's see. Well, maybe I've actually, That doesn't look good. Okay. Well, it's not on my screen, but I will get out of this and see. Ah, there we go. Okay, so from current slide. Ta-da! So, that pose, the armor, that expensive wheel armor, and Perugino dresses his Archangel Michael in that armor. An Archangel Michael who is surpassingly beautiful, with those marvelous wings that almost look scaly as well as feathery. Michael who would fight demons and devils. But you can see the pose is essentially that in the drawing. And we'll see it, well, we did see it in the second slide I showed, but we haven't seen this yet. But he would use it in more than one work. So that St. Michael is the left-hand panel of this polyptych from the Certosa of Pavia, which was painted for the Duke of Milan, for the Charterhouse of Pavia. And that's a Carthusian monastery in Pavia. And there are other pieces of it in other museums. A bit is still in Pavia, but this is what is in the National Gallery, and it was for an important client, the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, and it is of the absolute highest quality. Like the fish. Can you see the fish that Tobias is carrying? I'm going to try to zoom in again. Now I'm scared to do anything. See the fish? The fish is so beautifully observed. I mean, Pietro was looking at a real fish. Yeah, there's the fish. Oops, wait, no, I need this thingy again. Laser pointer. There's the fish right there. That armor, that shield, and that blue that Mary is wearing is ultramarine blue, which was ground from lapis lazuli that was imported across the Silk Road. It came from one mine in Afghanistan. It was more expensive than gold. And Vasari, although he says that Pietro was terrible, would make any terrible bargain for money, tells this story that does not support that point. And so I am tempted to think it is a true story. Quote, "There is a story which I have heard told of a prior of a convent who had employed him to paint in its cloisters. This prior was very good at making ultramarine, and therefore desired that Pietro should put a great deal into his works. He was, however, so miserably suspicious that he would not trust Pietro, but would always be present when he was using the ultramarine. Pietro took it ill that the prior should distrust him, and thought how he could shame him out of it. So he took a basin of water, and setting himself to his work, for every 2 brushfuls that he took, he washed his brush in the basin. So there was more color left in the water than he put into his work. The prior, seeing his bag getting empty and the picture not getting on, kept saying, 'Oh, how much ultramarine that plaster consumes.' But when the prior was gone, Pietro collected the ultramarine that was at the bottom of the basin, and when the time seemed right, he gave it back to the prior, saying, 'Father, this is yours. learned to trust honest men who never deceive those who trust in them, but know how to deceive when they choose suspicious men like you, end quote. So because I was so at odds of Vasari's overall take on Perugino, I have to imagine that it's true. This Perugino Madonna is also in the National Gallery. It's another stunningly beautiful work. There are 3 Raphael Madonnas in the same room as this painting, and it holds up very well. Again, you can see the lavish use of ultramarine, the beautiful changing silk that lines that mantle. But you also see that the baby is sort of looking out, which suggests he probably comes from a model from an altarpiece where there was a saint standing there for him to interact with. And if we look at some compositions that are really very similar, this was for a long time considered to be one of Perugino's masterpieces by the hand of the artist entirely, and now it's thought to be, at least in part, if not largely, a workshop production. But it is of the highest quality, because what was the job of the workshop? To produce Peruginos. Just like the job of Rembrandt's workshop was to produce Rembrandts. And so his students were trained to make the closest possible mimicry of Perugino's style. So this is a beautifully done roundel. This is an octagonal work of the same composition, and it's not as good. This one, Perugino probably didn't have any hand in. This one is more, now they're calling it School of Perugino. It's not the hand of the artist, but it's still, or would have been sold as a Perugino. From his workshop. It was the sort of thing that would have gone to a less well-heeled client. And in these years, in the 1490s, when he is so busy, he is so in demand, he is the hottest painter in Italy, and Raphael's father calls him the divine Perugino, and he's called by an agent for the Duke of Milan the best painter in Italy. Well, he was overcommitted. And so some things like this came out of the workshop, and some things he promised and promised and promised and never quite got to. And in 1896, he took on a commission in Perugia for the frescoes of the Collegio del Cambio, which is the Money Changers Guild. And you can still visit it. It's I have not seen it myself, but it is beautifully preserved. It is one of Perugino's great masterpieces, and it's been suggested that one of his assistants at this time would have been the 14, 15-year-old Raphael. But in the ceiling decoration, what you can see is that very all'antica evocation of classical, the kind of painting that was being found in excavations of actual Roman buildings, these sort of grotesques and sea serpents and so forth. So possibly Raphael was working on the ceiling, but one scholar who notes the overall high quality of this work has said that probably what Raphael learned most from this project was how to run an efficient workshop, how to organize your apprentices, from the ones that are just grinding the plaster and the colors, to the ones that are putting it on the wall, to the ones that are painting the skies, to the master painting the figures. And there's a very complicated program for this, which I'm not going to get into because I'm planning to do an entire lecture on just the Collegio del Cambio this fall after I come back from Perugia. but it's extraordinary. And can you see the painting hanging to the side of this fresco? Or what looks like a painting hanging to the side. It is all fresco. This is all flat. It's trompe-l'oeil, with coral beads and a frame, and it is Perugino's own self-portrait. And the inscription identifies him as Pietro Perugino, Petrus Perusinus, distinguished painter. And then there's a Latin epigram following that reads, when the art of color had been lost, he rediscovered it with patient determination. And when no one was giving it life, he was the first to create art that was beautiful. End quote. So he's a little proud of himself, and I think rightfully so. Here in the Vallombrosa altarpiece, made for the monastery at Vallombrosa, whom do we find again? Another St. Michael, based on that drawing of the man with the armor. Now he's in the lower right. And this one has 3 tiers, with God the Father at the top, and then Mary in the middle tier, and then the saints in the ground level, but all of them suffused with the light and the atmosphere. And the predella, the lower portion with the little panels of this painting, included some portraits of the donors, of the monks, which are such extraordinary portraits with so much naturalism. This one's Don Baldassare. Well, by this time, Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, had been bugging Perugino for several years to paint a painting for her studiolo. And it took more than 7 years for Perugino to finally consign her this painting. It is another mythological work, Combat of Love and Chastity. And Isabella d'Este, I love her, but she was a micromanager. And she insisted that this painting have this particular subject of Diana and Athena fighting vigorously against Venus and Cupid. So she wrote this long description of what's supposed to be in this painting. So in addition to those, they have to fight fiercely with a lascivious crowd of fawns, satyrs, and several thousand cupids. And she also wanted, and got, she wanted the rape of Europa, Apollo and Daphne, the Cyclops and Galatea, all this stuff. And she wanted it to be tempera on canvas, and for the figures to be the exact same size as Mantegna's figures in his tempera on canvas painting that he had already painted for her. Wow. And anyway, she ended up with this, and then she didn't like it. She said it would have been better in oil. Well, yes, it would have been better in oil, but she said it had to be tempera. So not one of his great successes, but at the same time he was painting one of his greatest works, his Marriage of the Virgin, for Perugia, for the Cathedral of Perugia, drawn from, I hope obviously, the giving of the keys to St. Peter from the Sistine Chapel, but here compressed just that single building in the background with its very Renaissance architecture, a centrally planned church, and open through to the beautiful airy background. Well, in 1505, the painter Filipino Lippi died, and he had been commissioned to paint some works in the Church of Santissima Annunziata in Florence. And Perugino was given the commission to complete the assignment. And he painted this Assumption of the Virgin. Only now it's 1507. And the crowds mocked this work. They said that Perugino was just repeating himself, that he was just doing the same thing over and over, that there was no variety, that it was insipid, and so forth. And Michelangelo even called Perugino publicly goffo nell'arte, awkward, a bungler. And this was devastating for Perugino. And the British critic John Ruskin would write in the 19th century, quote, "The abuse of Perugino by Michelangelo is, as far as my knowledge of history extends, the most cruel, the most false, and the most foolish insult ever offered by one great man to another," end quote. But he didn't have the acclaim. And Perugino said, "I painted the same things that you praised before. If you're not praising them now, I don't know what to do about that." But that was exactly the core of the problem. Nevertheless, Peruginesque painters like Francesco Francia continued to paint Peruginos all over Italy, from the north to the south, for a number of years. Well, Perugino went to Rome and was invited by the new Pope, Julius II, to paint the ceiling of one of the rooms in the Vatican stanze. And he painted this, this ceiling with these roundels of God the Father and Jesus the lawgiver and so forth. But this is 1508. Who's working practically next door in the Sistine Chapel? Michelangelo. And so this looks pretty quaint when it is compared to this. And so Perugino was asked to go home, and the commission was given instead to his former student, Raphael, who was painting this sort of thing, this much more muscular, this X-shaped composition for the ceiling of the Stanza della Segnatura, where he would paint his glorious visions of the school of Athens, the Disputa, and so forth, but where he also pays homage at the very right hand of the work to himself and to his teacher, Perugino, right there. So Perugino closed his Florentine workshop, he left Rome, he went back to Perugia. But he still had a workshop in Perugia and plenty of work in Umbria, in Perugia itself. He painted this baptism of Christ, and he goes back to fresco, which is really a young man's technique. It involves scaffolding and plastering, and it's hard physical work, but I have to think that Perugino loved it. It's what he does the most of in his last few years, and by this time he is in his 60s, early 70s. This lovely Madonna is in a convent in the outskirts of Perugia. Apparently you can ring a bell and visit it. And his very last work was this nativity painted in Fontignano. And that's in the countryside, outside of Perugia. Perugino had hoped to escape the plague by working in Fontignano, but it didn't quite work. And he died of plague in 1523, but he was working right up until the end. But the work I really am intrigued by is this Holy Trinity with saints in the chapel of San Severo in Perugia. It was Raphael's commission in 1505, but Raphael never finished it. But the top is all Raphael. That upper register, that Peruginesque upper register, but it's also in germ form the Disputation on the Sacrament that he would paint much more amply in the Stanza della Segnatura when he was called to Rome in 1508. And so up at the top we have the beginnings of that new style. We have that 22-year-old, 23-year-old artist creating this new style, but having thoroughly absorbed his master's style. And then 15 years later, after the death of Raphael at only 37, Perugino finishes this fresco. So the saints at the bottom are Perugino's work, this 70-plus-year-old artist, one of his very last works, and it must have been so poignant finishing his student's fresco, and he does it the way that he always had. He doesn't adapt to what would have been probably a more semicircular composition had Raphael completed it. And yes, Perugino was an original and brilliant artist, and he repeated himself. He repeated figures and themes. He used cartoons more than once in different locations. He was an artist of his own generation, and it's not fair to judge him by the standards of the next generation. But he gave that next generation his feel for nature, his grace and elegance, and the sheer loveliness of his figures. So that the High Renaissance would not be all Michelangelesque muscle. If you're going to be in Perugia in the next 10 days or so, before June 11th, I hope you will see the spectacular Perugino show there. I am going to miss it. But I am going to be in Perugia for my first time this fall, thanks to the Seattle Perugia Sister City Association. And I cannot wait to see those works of Perugino that are still in the area. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions, and then we would like one of our SPSCA board members to make a few remarks. But are there questions about Perugino? Yes?
This isn't a very important question, but you used the term cartoon.
Oh, yes.
How does that relate to this kind of...
I apologize. I used the word cartoon without explaining it. What Raphael and Perugino called a cartoon is not at all what we call a cartoon. It was rather a drawing at the same scale as the work that is going to be based on it. And so, I'm not going to go back all the way to the drawing. So you can imagine that for each of these figures, there is a drawing that originally that Perugino has made, but then his students have copied, and they grid it, and then they work it up to full size. And if it's a fresco, they slap that cartoon, as it's called, right onto the plaster. And they might have taken a dressmaker's wheel, something that is essentially identical to a dressmaker's wheel, and rolled the major outlines of that drawing, hold it up to the plaster, take a bag full of charcoal dust, and go pump, 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 so that the dust seeps through the holes that you've made, and you get a dot drawing on your wet plaster, which is what fresco is painted in. Fresco is painted into wet plaster. You plaster as much as you can cover in a single day, and then you have to join it to the next day, which Perugino somehow did seamlessly. So a cartoon it's a full-size drawing that is used in the production of an altarpiece or a fresco. Often the ones for frescoes would just get destroyed. But for an altarpiece, Perugino might just keep that drawing in his studio and use that Mary Magdalene or St. John another time, another year. So that is what I meant by cartoon, and I apologize for not explaining that, because it's an art historical term. It's a specialist term. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, where is Perugino buried?
Where is Perugino buried? That is an excellent question. I don't know. So he died in Folignano,
Okay.
and I don't know if they brought him back to Perugia to bury him there or not. Does anyone know where, Joanne?
I think Città della Pieve.
Oh, Città della Pieve. So that is where he was born. It's in the countryside outside of Perugia. And it's sort of like, if you're from Burien, you say you're from Seattle. And he did sign, first he started signing his altarpieces, Petrus Perusinus. At a certain point in his career, he did sign some Petrus from Città della Pieve. So he did refer to that. Now, once he'd sort of made it, then he could refer to those more humble roots. Yes?
Has Perugino's reputation been resurrected for current day contemporary art historians? Do they appreciate? Has he outlived
Vasari? Yes. Has Perugino's reputation been resuscitated? Yes. And in fact, I have to admit that when I was at the National Gallery, one of my jobs was to sort of do what I'm doing right now, but with actual works of art. And in one lecture, I looked at the Perugino with the St. John and Mary Magdalene with the same pose, and I sort of dissed it. And my supervisor, who was a historian of Renaissance art, said, "You're talking about the work of a very great artist." And I had to mentally take a step back, because I had absorbed that Vasarian critique of Perugino's work that was absolutely the practice in Ghirlandaio's workshop and Verrocchio's workshop, and it was what was done in the 1480s. And yes, so in the intervening years, absolutely, there is, I think, and I think right now with this 500th anniversary exhibit, interest has never been higher, and Perugino's star has never been higher since, 1506. So yeah. So yes.
Is that exhibit traveling or?
I don't believe that exhibit is traveling. It's really just going there. And there were similar exhibits in 2020 for the 500th anniversary of Raphael's death that no one saw because of COVID. So we're lucky that people can see this one and maybe get a good, because we all know who Raphael was pretty much. But now people can get a good sense of who Perugino was. Well, thank you all so much, and Elisabetta.